The year was 2157, and the Stellar Plaza Mall on New Earth Colony sparkled under 3 artificial suns. Han Sujai stood at the main entrance, looking up at the massive glass dome that protected shoppers from the planet's harsh atmosphere. She reached up to adjust her old red hat, making sure it sat properly on her head. The hat was special. It had been in her family for over 130 years. Suji smiled as she watched humans and aliens walk past her. Some gave her curious looks, but most were too busy with their shopping to notice her. She liked it that way. Today, she wasn't here as the CEO of Stellar Developments Corporation. Today, she was just another visitor to the mall she had secretly bought last week. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a burst of cool air. Sujai stepped inside, her comfortable shoes making no sound on the polished floor. The mall was even more impressive from the inside. Holographic signs floated in the air, advertising everything from Earth-style coffee to Rigelian crystal sculptures. The sweet smell of fresh-baked cookies mixed with the strange but pleasant scent of alien spices. "Welcome to Stellar Plaza," chirped a helpful robot near the entrance. "Would you like a digital map?" "No, thank you," Suji replied politely. "I'd like to explore on my own." She walked past the robot, taking in every detail. This mall was different from the others she owned. It was older, with some wear showing in the corners, but it had character. The mix of Earth and alien businesses made it special. She saw a traditional Korean restaurant next to a Rigelian food stall, their different cooking smells creating an interesting blend in the air. Suji stopped to watch a group of Rigelian children, or what looked like children, pressing their faces against a toy store window. Their scales changed colors with excitement as they pointed at the latest hover toys. Their parents stood nearby, their translator device converting their clicks and whistles into clear English as they promised to return after work. Taking out her data pad, Suji made some notes. The toy store would need bigger windows, she thought, and maybe some seating for waiting parents. Small changes could make a big difference. As she walked, she noticed things that needed fixing. A flickering hologram, a crack in one of the decorative fountains, a shop with poor lighting. But she also saw things that made her happy. Store owners chatting with customers like old friends, children from different species playing together in the central court, and small businesses that had clearly been here for years. The hat on her head felt warm and familiar. It had belonged to her great-grandmother, who had kept it safe through good times and bad. Some people didn't understand why she wore it. To them, it was just an old political symbol from a complicated time in Earth's history. But to Suji, it was a reminder of how far humans had come. Her family had arrived in America with nothing, built a business during tough times, and now here she was, generations later, buying malls on other planets. She stopped at a small coffee shop run by an elderly Korean man named Park Jin-woo. The shop wasn't fancy, but it was clean and welcoming. The smell of fresh coffee and sweet hotteok filled the air. "One traditional coffee, please," Suji said, sitting at the counter. Jin-woo smiled as he prepared her drink. Not many people order traditional coffee anymore. Everyone wants the instant neural stim drinks these days. Suji watched him carefully measure the ground coffee beans and hot water. "Some things are better the old way," she replied. As she sipped her coffee, she observed the morning crowd growing larger. Humans in business clothes rushed past with breakfast in their hands. Rigelian merchants began opening their crystal shops, their scales shimmering as they arranged their displays. A group of teenage girls, 2 human, 1 Rigelian, sat nearby, sharing a plate of hotteok and giggling over something on their holopads. "Things have changed so much," Jin-woo said, wiping the counter. "When I first opened this shop 15 years ago, humans and Rigelians wouldn't even eat in the same food court. Now look at them." Suji nodded, making another note on her pad. This was exactly why she had bought them all. It wasn't just a shopping center. It was a place where different cultures came together. It needed work, yes, but it had potential. She finished her coffee and stood up, leaving a generous tip. As she walked toward the central court, she saw a tall Korean man in a crisp uniform talking to a security guard. From his badge and the way he carried himself, she could tell this was Kim Do-hyun, the mall manager. Her assistant had sent her his file, but she wanted to observe him in action before their official meeting next week. Do-hyun was pointing at a holographic sign that was slightly out of alignment. The security guard nodded repeatedly as Do-hyun explained exactly how many centimeters it needed to be adjusted. Soo-ji held back a smile. He was definitely detail-oriented, maybe too much so. She was about to head to the upper level when she noticed Do-hyun's eyes lock onto her hat. His expression changed from professional to concerned, then to something harder. He said something to the security guard and began walking in her direction with quick, purposeful steps. Soo-ji could have revealed who she was right then. She could have taken out her ID and stopped what was about to happen. But she wanted to see how her new mall manager handled situations on his own. How did he treat regular customers? How did he handle things he didn't like? She pretended not to notice him approaching and instead turned to look at a window display of Rigelian crystals. The crystals caught the light from the artificial suns, creating beautiful patterns on the floor. Behind her, she could hear Do-hyun's footsteps getting closer. Her data pad buzzed quietly. It was a message from her assistant, Lee Jae-yun. Board members arriving in 30 minutes for the official handover. Where should we meet you? Soo-ji smiled slightly as she typed her response. Central Court. And Jae-yun, take your time getting here. I think we're about to have an interesting morning. She put away her pad just as Do-hyun's reflection appeared in the crystal shop window. She could see his name badge clearly now, along with the tight, disapproving line of his mouth as he stared at her hat. This was going to be educational for everyone involved. The first artificial sun reached its peak position, sending bright rays through the glass dome. Around them, the mall continued its morning routine. Shop owners arranged displays, customers browsed stores, and somewhere in the distance, those Rigelian children were still begging for hover toys. None of them knew they were about to witness something that would change Stellar Plaza Mall forever. Soo-ji turned around slowly, ready to face whatever came next. She had built her business on understanding people, how they think, how they react, what they can learn. Today's events would show her exactly what kind of people she had in her new mall and what kind of work lay ahead. The red hat sat firmly on her head, a piece of history about to collide with the present. And Han Soo-ji, who had faced boardrooms full of angry executives and negotiated deals with alien species, was curious to see what would happen next. Kim Do-hyun had managed Stellar Plaza Mall for 5 years, and he took great pride in keeping it running smoothly. He believed in order, cleanliness, and most importantly, keeping everyone comfortable. That's why the red hat caught his attention immediately. He knew his history, and that hat meant trouble. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, stepping in front of Soo-ji. His voice was polite but firm. "I need to speak with you about your headwear." Soo-ji turned to face him fully. She had kind eyes and wore simple but expensive clothes. But that hat, that ancient symbol of division, had no place in his modern mall. "Yes," she asked calmly. "I apologize, but we have a strict dress code policy here at Stellar Plaza," Do-hyun said. He stood very straight, trying to look as official as possible. "That particular hat is a historical item that might make other customers uncomfortable." Soo-ji touched the brim of her hat gently. "This is a family heirloom," she explained. "It's over 130 years old. My great-grandmother kept it to remind us of how times change." Do-hyun frowned. He hadn't expected such a calm response. Usually, people got angry right away when he pointed out dress code violations. "I understand it has personal value," he said, "but this is a modern, multicultural shopping center. We can't have symbols that might upset our diverse customers." A small crowd was starting to gather. 2 Rigelian merchants had stopped arranging their crystal displays to watch. Their scales flickered between curious blue and concerned green colors. A group of human teenagers stood nearby, whispering and pointing at their holopads. Have any customers complained? Suji asked. She looked around at the gathering crowd with interest. Well, no, Do-hyun admitted. Not yet. But it's my job to prevent problems before they start. He tapped his badge importantly. As mall manager, I have to think about everyone's comfort. Suji nodded thoughtfully. That's a good quality in a manager, she said, caring about others. But sometimes we learn more by talking about hard topics than by hiding them away. This conversation wasn't going the way Do-hyun had planned. The woman was too reasonable, too calm. It made him feel slightly off balance, but he had his rules, and rules were rules. I'm sorry, but I must insist, he said, his voice getting firmer. You'll need to remove the hat or leave the mall. More people were watching now. Park Jin-woo had stepped out of his coffee shop to see what was happening. The Regelian children from the toy store had stopped begging for hover toys and were watching with all four of their eyes wide open. And if I choose not to remove it? Suji asked. She wasn't angry or defiant. She seemed genuinely curious about his answer. Do-hyun felt sweat forming on his forehead. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. People usually got mad or embarrassed or both. They didn't ask calm questions that made him think. Then I'll have to call security, he said. He tried to sound confident, but his voice wavered slightly. I see. Sujai looked at him with what seemed like sympathy. And you believe that's the best way to handle this situation? Do-hyun felt his face getting hot. Why was she making this so difficult? Mall policy is very clear about controversial symbols, he said. He pulled out his datapad and brought up the rules. Section 12, paragraph 3 states, Excuse me, a Regelian merchant interrupted, their translator device converting their clicks into slightly accented English. We find this interesting. On our world, we keep historical items in public view, even difficult ones. It helps us remember and learn. This is different, Do-hyun said quickly. This symbol is from a time when humans were still learning how to accept differences. Suji finished for him. Just like your people once had troubles with the Crystal Clan Wars, right? She said to the Regelian merchant. The Regelian scales turned a surprised purple. You know of our history. I try to learn about all cultures, Suji said. It helps avoid misunderstandings. Do-hyun felt like he was losing control of the situation. More people were gathering in the central court. Some were recording with their holopads. This was exactly the kind of scene he had wanted to prevent. Security, he said into his wrist communicator. Please come to the central court. Suji sighed softly. If you're sure that's necessary, she said. She looked at her own datapad. They should be here in about 3 minutes, based on their usual response time. Do-hyun stared at her. How did she know their response time? Before he could ask, heavy footsteps approached. Park Min-ho, the head of security, arrived with 2 other guards. What seems to be a problem? Sir, Min-ho asked, looking between Do-hyun and Suji. This woman refuses to remove a controversial historical symbol, Do-hyun said. She needs to be escorted out. Min-ho looked at Suji, then at her hat. He seemed uncertain. Ma'am, if you could just... Look, someone in the crowd shouted. By the main entrance. Do-hyun turned to see what everyone was looking at. A group of well-dressed people was walking through the main entrance. They wore expensive business suits and carried official-looking briefcases. Leading them was a sharp-looking woman he recognized as Lee Jae-yun, the corporate representative he was supposed to meet next week about the mall's new ownership. Jae-yun walked quickly toward their group, her heels clicking on the polished floor. The crowd parted to let her through. She stopped next to Suji and bowed deeply. Madam Chairwoman, Jae-yun said clearly, the board members have arrived for the ownership transfer ceremony. Are you ready to begin? The central court went completely silent. Do-hyun felt all the blood drain from his face. He looked at Suji again, really looked at her this time. Behind those kind eyes and simple clothes was one of the richest and most powerful business leaders in the solar system. Chairwoman, he squeaked. Suji smiled gently. Yes, Mr. Kim. Han Suji, CEO of Stellar Developments Corporation. She gestured at the mall around them. And as of about 10 minutes ago, the new owner of this establishment. Do-hyun heard Min-ho trying not to laugh behind him. The Rigelian children had all turned bright yellow, their color for extreme amusement. Even their translator couldn't keep up with their excited chittering. Aye. Do-hyun struggled to find words. Perhaps, Suji said kindly, we should continue this conversation in your office. We have much to discuss about history, understanding, and the future of this mall. The crowd began to disperse, but Do-hyun could hear them whispering excitedly. This story would be all over the colony's social networks within hours. He had just tried to kick the new owner out of her own mall. As Suji walked past him toward the management offices, she stopped briefly. Your attention to detail is admirable, she said quietly, and your desire to protect others is good. But sometimes, Mr. Kim, the best way to help people isn't to hide difficult things, but to help them understand them. Do-hyun watched her walk away, her red hat still sitting firmly on her head. The three artificial suns continued their path across the dome above, their light catching on the Rigelian crystals and creating patterns that danced across the floor. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear Park Jin-woo laughing softly from his coffee shop. It was going to be a very interesting day at Stellar Plaza Mall. The walk to the management office felt like the longest journey of Do-hyun's life. Every step echoed in his ears as he followed Han Suji and the board members down the quiet hallway. The morning's events kept playing over and over in his mind. He had tried to throw out the owner of his mall. The owner of his mall. Suji's assistant, Lee Jae-yun, walked beside her boss, occasionally glancing at her datapad. The board members followed behind, their expensive shoes making soft sounds on the polished floor. Two Rigelian executives clicked quietly to each other, their scales shifting between amused yellow and professional blue. When they reached the office, Do-hyun's hands shook slightly as he pressed his palm to the security scanner. The door slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing his perfectly organized workspace. Awards for Best Managed Mall hung on the walls. Charts showing rising sales numbers covered one screen. Everything was in its place, just as he liked it. Please, everyone have a seat, Suji said, as if this were her office already. Which, Do-hyun remembered with a sinking feeling, it technically was. The board members arranged themselves around the large meeting table. Jae-yun connected her data pad to the room's holographic display system, and documents began floating in the air above the table. Property transfer agreements, management reports, and financial statements spun slowly, waiting to be reviewed. Mr. Kim, Suji said gently, would you like to sit down? Do-hyun realized he was still standing by the door. Yes, Madam Chairwoman. I apologize for my behavior earlier, if I had known. If you had known who I was, you would have acted differently. Suji asked. She wasn't angry, but her question made Do-hyun's face feel hot with shame. That's exactly why I didn't tell you. I wanted to see how you treat regular customers. One of the Rigelian board members made a sound that their translator device converted to laughter. Your Earth methods are interesting, Madam Chairwoman. On our world, we call this testing the waters with all four legs. A wise practice, Suji agreed. She turned back to Do-hyun. Tell me, Mr. Kim, why did my hat bother you so much? Do-hyun looked down at his hands. It's a symbol from a difficult time in Earth's history. I'd worried it might upset people, especially our alien customers who might not understand its context. And yet, Suji said, the only person who seemed upset was you. She gestured to the Rigelian executives. Our friends here found it educational. The customers in the mall were curious, not offended. The young ones especially, clicked one of the Rigelian board members. My offspring will have many questions about Earth history when I return home. Jae-yun stepped forward, her data pad displaying new information. Mr. Kim, your record as mall manager is excellent. Sales are up 23% since you took over. Customer satisfaction scores are among the highest in the colony. You clearly care about doing a good job. Do-hyun felt a small spark of hope. Maybe he wasn't about to lose his position after all. However, Jae-yun continued, we've noticed some concerning patterns. She waved her hand, and new charts appeared. Complaints about strict dress code enforcement have increased 45% in the past year. 3 cultural festivals were canceled due to concerns about potential conflicts. The multi-species poetry readings in the food court were discontinued. I was trying to keep things peaceful, Do-hyun said quietly, to avoid any problems before they could start. Soo-jae stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the central court. Below, the mall was buzzing with activity. Humans and aliens shopped together, ate together, laughed together. Do you know what I see down there? She asked. Do-hyun joined her at the window. Customers. I see opportunity, Soo-jae said. I see different species learning from each other, teaching each other, growing together. She touched her red hat again. Even difficult history can bring people together if we let it. The door chimed, and Park Jin-woo from the coffee shop entered carrying a tray. Sorry to interrupt, he said, setting down cups of traditional coffee and some Rigelian crystal tea. Thought everyone might need refreshments. Perfect timing. Soo-jae said with a smile. Mr. Park, would you tell everyone what you told me this morning about how things have changed? Jin-woo nodded as he poured coffee. When I opened my shop 15 years ago, humans and Rigelians wouldn't even eat in the same food court. Now they share tables, try each other's food, even learn each other's languages. He looked at Do-hyun. Change isn't always comfortable, but it's how we grow. The Rigelian executives clicked in agreement, their scales turning a thoughtful shade of purple. One of them picked up a coffee cup with their careful grip. We remember those early days. Many of us thought humans and Rigelians could never truly understand each other. Now look, we drink their coffee, they collect our crystals, our children play together. Do-hyun sat back down, feeling overwhelmed. Everything he thought he knew about managing the mall was being questioned. But as he looked around the room, he didn't see anger or judgment in anyone's faces. Instead, he saw people, human and alien, who wanted to help him understand. So, Soo-jae said, returning to her seat, let's talk about the future of Stellar Plaza. Jae-yun, please show everyone the plans for our new historical education center. A holographic display changed to show architectural designs. A new section of the mall appeared, with spaces for cultural exhibits, historical artifacts, and meeting areas where different species could share their stories. This is where we'll display items from Earth's history, Soo-jae explained, pointing to one area, including controversial pieces like my hat. But we'll also have spaces for Rigelian history, artifacts from the Crystal Clan Wars, and items from other species who join our community. But won't that cause problems? Do-hyun asked, then quickly added, I mean, won't people disagree about how to interpret these things? Of course they will, Soo-jae said with a warm smile. That's the point. We learn more from respectful disagreement than from avoiding difficult topics entirely. She turned to the board members. What do you think? The room filled with excited discussion. The Rigelian executives clicked rapidly about how this could improve cultural understanding. Human board members suggested educational programs for children. Even Jin-woo, still serving coffee, offered ideas about featuring historical recipes from different worlds. As Do-hyun listened, he felt something changing inside him. The tight knot of anxiety about keeping everything perfect began to loosen. Maybe perfect wasn't about avoiding all possible problems. Maybe it was about creating a space where people could learn from each other, even when it wasn't comfortable. Mr. Kim, Soo-jae said, bringing his attention back to her, I'm not going to fire you. Do-hyun let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But she continued, I am going to ask you to learn, to grow. to help us build something new here. She smiled. Are you willing to try? Looking around the room at the excited faces, human and alien, Do-hyun felt a new kind of pride growing. Not pride in perfect order, but pride in being part of something bigger, something that could help people understand each other better. Yes, Madam Chairwoman, he said. I'd like that very much. Suji nodded, pleased. Good. Now let's talk about bringing back those multi-species poetry readings. I hear they were quite popular. The next few weeks brought many changes to Stellar Plaza Mall. The biggest change wasn't in the building itself, but in the way Do-hyun saw his job. Each morning, as he walked through the main entrance, he found himself noticing different things than before. Instead of looking for problems to fix, he started seeing opportunities to learn. When a group of Regelian teenagers wore their traditional scale paint to the mall, something he would have once considered too flashy, he asked them about its meaning. They spent 20 minutes explaining how different patterns told stories about their family's history. Suji visited the mall regularly now, always wearing her red hat. She had turned the empty store next to Park Jin-woo's coffee shop into a temporary office. Every morning, she would get her traditional coffee and talk with customers about their experiences at the mall. The young ones asked about your hat again. Jin-woo told her one morning as he poured her coffee. I told them to come back this afternoon. Thought you might want to explain it yourself. Suji smiled. Perfect. Maybe Mr. Kim would like to join us for that conversation. She looked at Do-hyun, who was checking the day's maintenance schedules nearby. Do-hyun looked up from his datapad. A month ago, the idea of discussing controversial Earth history with children would have made him nervous. Now, he found himself nodding. I'd like that, he said. I could learn something too. The construction of the new Historical Education Center had begun in the mall's East Wing. Do-hyun watched as workers installed special display cases designed to hold artifacts from different worlds. Each case had a holographic system that could show the full history of the item inside. One morning, as Do-hyun supervised the installation of a new display case, a Regelian merchant approached him. Their scales were shifting between excited yellow and nervous green. Manager Kim, they clicked, their translator converting the sounds to clear English. Would you consider, that is, my family has kept something from the Crystal Clan Wars, a peace treaty signed by both sides. Would it be appropriate for display? A month ago, Do-hyun would have said no immediately. Anything related to conflicts or wars seemed too risky. But now he found himself really thinking about it. Tell me about the treaty, he said. Why did your family keep it? The Regelian scales turned a deep blue of memory and reflection. It reminds us that enemies can become friends, that understanding can grow from conflict. Much like your owner's hat, yes. Do-hyun smiled. Exactly like that. Let's talk to Madam Han about adding it to the collection. The mall's atmosphere began to change too. The strict dress code signs came down, replaced by new ones that read, all species, all cultures welcome. The multi-species poetry readings started again in the food court, now with twice as many participants as before. One day, Suji called Do-hyun to her temporary office. Jae-hyun was there too, along with several Regelian cultural advisors. The office walls were covered with plans and drawings. Mr. Kim, Suji said, we'd like your input on something important. She gestured to the drawings. These are the final designs for the History Center. We want it to be a place where people can learn from each other, but also feel safe asking questions. Do-hyun studied the plans carefully. He noticed areas marked for group discussions, private reflection spaces, and interactive learning zones. There was even a special section for children to learn about different cultures through play. What do you think? Jae-hyun asked. You know our regular customers better than anyone. Do-hyun thought about all he had learned in the past month, about how trying to avoid difficult conversations often made things worse, about how understanding grew from asking questions and listening to answers. I think, he said slowly, we should add more seating in the discussion areas, and maybe a cafe, like Mr. Parks. People talk more openly when they're comfortable. The Regellian advisors clicked in agreement, their scales turning approval purple. Suji nodded, making notes on her datapad. Also, Do-hyun continued, surprising himself with his confidence, we should have a section where people can share their own historical items, not just for display, but to tell their stories. Like a community history wall. Jae-hyun asked, already sketching the idea. Yes, Do-hyun said, because everyone has something to teach and something to learn. Suji smiled, touching the brim of her red hat. Exactly, Mr. Kim. That's exactly right. Later that day, Do-hyun watched from his office window as a class of mixed human and Regellian children toured the mall. They stopped at different shops, learning about products and customs from various worlds. When they reached Park Jin-woo's coffee shop, the old man showed them how to make traditional earth coffee and Regellian crystal tea. The children were fascinated, asking questions about everything. Why did humans drink hot drinks when it was warm? Why did Regellians prefer their tea to change colors? How did different species learn to enjoy each other's food? Do-hyun realized he was smiling. A month ago, he would have worried about the noise, the questions, the potential for problems. Now he saw what Suji had been talking about, opportunity. The chance to learn, to grow, to understand. His datapad beeped with a message from Suji. Meeting tomorrow about the grand opening of the History Center. Bring your ideas. And Mr. Kim, thank you for being willing to learn. Do-hyun looked around his office at the awards on his walls. Best Managed Mall still meant something to him, but now it meant something different. It wasn't just about keeping things clean and orderly. It was about creating a space where different species could come together, share their stories, and learn from each other. Outside his window, the 3 artificial suns were setting, creating a beautiful light show through the mall's glass dome. The Regellian crystals caught the light, sending rainbow patterns dancing across the walls. Somewhere in the food court, the evening poetry reading was beginning, voices and clicks mixing together in a strange but wonderful harmony. Do-hyun touched his mall manager badge, thinking about how much its meaning had changed for him. He wasn't just managing a building anymore. He was helping manage the growth of understanding between different peoples and cultures. And somehow, it had all started with a woman in a red hat who wasn't afraid to teach difficult lessons with kindness. 6 months had passed since the day Han Suji wore her red hat to Stellar Plaza Mall. The mall had changed so much that visitors who hadn't been there in a while often stopped in surprise when they entered. The central court, once just a simple meeting place, had become the heart of something special. The Historical Education Center took up a large space near Park Jin-woo's coffee shop. Its entrance featured a beautiful arch made of earth stone and Regellian crystals. Above the door, words in multiple languages spelled out, "Understanding grows from knowledge." Do-hyun stood in the center's main hall, watching visitors explore the exhibits. The red hat that had started everything sat in a special display case. Next to it was the Regellian Peace Treaty, its crystal frame catching light from the artificial suns. Each item had a holographic display that told its full story. Amazing how much can change in 6 months, isn't it? Suji said, walking up beside him. She still visited the mall regularly, though she no longer needed to wear the hat to teach her lessons. I was just thinking about that day, Do-hyun admitted, about how wrong I was. Suji shook her head. Not wrong. Just learning. We're all always learning. They watched as a group of school children, humans, Regellians, and even 2 young Centaurians, gathered around the community history wall. This was Do-hyun's idea, now one of the most popular features. People brought in their own historical items to share, each with a story to tell. Today, an elderly human woman was showing the children a wooden spoon that her family had brought from Earth over 50 years ago. Next to her, a Regellian elder used their translator to explain the significance of a crystal medallion from their first spaceflight. Mr. Kim, called a young Regellian voice. It was one of the children who had been begging for hover toys that first day. Now they were a regular visitor to the History Center. "Will you tell us the story about the hat again?" Do-hyun smiled. He enjoyed telling this story now. "Well," he began, as children gathered around. "It started 6 months ago, when I thought I knew everything about running a mall." The children listened eagerly as he told them about that day. He didn't hide his mistakes or try to make himself look better. Instead, he used the story to show how everyone could learn and grow. "And that's why we have this center now," he finished. "Because sometimes the things that make us uncomfortable are the things we most need to understand." The Regellian child's scales turned the bright blue of new knowledge. "Like how my grandmother didn't want to try earth food at first, but now she loves Mr. Park's coffee." "Exactly like that," Do-hyun agreed. The mall had become famous across the colony. People came from other settlements to see how different species could work and learn together. The food court now hosted cooking classes, where people shared recipes from their home worlds. The shop owners had started a cultural exchange program, teaching each other about their traditional products. Park Jin-woo's coffee shop had grown too. He now had a special section for alien beverages, each with its own story written on the wall. He worked with Regellian crystal tea masters to create new drinks that both species could enjoy. Madame Han called Jae-yun, walking quickly toward them with her datapad. "The board members are here for the 6-month review." Suji nodded. "Mr. Kim, would you like to present the results yourself?" Do-hyun straightened his badge proudly. In the past 6 months, the mall's success had grown beyond anything they had expected. But more importantly, it had grown in ways that couldn't be measured in numbers. The board meeting took place in the History Center's community room. The walls were covered with photos showing events from the past 6 months. The center's opening day, the first multi-species food festival, children's education programs, and community gatherings. Stellar Plaza has always been profitable. Do-hyun began his presentation. But now it's also meaningful. "Let me show you what we've achieved." He displayed charts showing rising visitor numbers and sales figures. But then he showed something else: statistics about cultural exchange programs, education center participation, and community involvement. "Last week," he said proudly, "we had our first wedding here. A human bride and a Regellian life partner, celebrating their union in both traditions. They chose our mall because, in their words, it's a place where everyone belongs." The Regellian board members' scales turned joy yellow. The human members nodded approvingly. Suji sat quietly, a small smile on her face. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story," Do-hyun continued. "Let me show you something else." He led the board members to the community history wall. New items had been added just that morning. A piece of the original mall's foundation, donated by the construction crew that had built it. A traditional earth calendar from the first shop that had opened here. A Regellian crystal that had been part of their first trade agreement with humans. "This is what Stellar Plaza has become," Do-hyun said. "Not just a place to shop, but a place to share our stories, to learn from each other, to grow together." After the board meeting, Do-hyun found himself back in the main hall. The artificial suns were setting, creating a spectacular light show through the crystal decorations. The evening poetry reading was about to begin in the food court. He could smell Park Jin-woo's coffee mixing with Regellian crystal tea. A young human girl stopped in front of the Red Hat's display. "Mr. Kim," she asked, "why do you keep an old hat in such a special place?" Do-hyun knelt down beside her. "Because sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected places. This hat taught me that trying to avoid difficult things doesn't make them go away. It's better to talk about them, to understand them, and to learn from them." The girl thought about this for a moment. "Like how my mom says we should talk about our feelings even when they're hard." "Exactly like that," Do-hyun smiled. "Would you like to hear the story of how this hat changed our mall?" The girl nodded eagerly, and Do-hyun began the tale once again. As he spoke, more people gathered to listen. Humans, Regellians, Centaurians, all different, all together, all learning. Above them, The mall's glass dome reflected the last rays of the artificial suns. The Rigelian crystals caught the light, sending rainbow patterns dancing across the walls. And in its special display case, an old red hat sat proudly, no longer a symbol of division, but a reminder that understanding could grow in the most unexpected ways. Stellar Plaza had evolved into something more than just a mall. It had become a place where history wasn't hidden away, where difficult conversations were welcomed, and where different species came together to learn from each other. And it had all started because a woman in a red hat had been brave enough to teach a lesson with kindness, and a mall manager had been willing to learn.